Hey guys, you're listening to episode 183 of The Modern Acre. This week, Tim and I are going to give a quick update about everything going on at Nuss Farms and our regenerative transition. And we're also going to re-air an episode that we did about a year ago with John Kempf, talking all things regenerative agriculture, which is one of our favorite episodes.
You're listening to the Modern Acre Podcast. Every week, you'll hear from the entrepreneurs, innovators, and leaders that are changing the food and agricultural industry on and off the farm. Your hosts are Tim and Tyler Nuss. They are brothers, fifth-generation farmers, and entrepreneurs who have scaled tech startups, developed international supply chains, and built brands. The Modern Acre is ag built different.
So Ty, we're just coming back from a pretty big weekend. We were up in Lake Tahoe celebrating our mom's 60th birthday. It was fun to get a couple days off and spend it with the family. It's been a while since we've seen each other in person, so it was a fun few days.
It was really fun to finally be all together. Obviously, the last time I think you and Derek both saw Emmy, she was probably under 6 months, and now she just turned a year. So she's about to walk, and it was just fun for you to spend time with Charlotte too. She was very excited to see her Uncle Tim and the whole family. She was pretty over the top cute, I would say.
Yeah, it was super cute. It was fun spending time with my nieces. We got a couple good beach days in and went paddleboarding. So it was just a really awesome time. It's always a challenge getting the family together, especially over the summer when there's so much going on at the farm. So we picked a location that was somewhat close to Lodi, where it's an hour and a half for Dad and Dare, since it's a little bit more challenging for them to break away during these really busy months.
It's kind of an ongoing joke in our family because my mom usually gets a short end of the stick when it comes to birthdays because it is in the middle of the season. And, being part of a farm family, just the farm always takes priority. So I think it was good in time that mom deserved a really dedicated special weekend. But I know Dad and Derek were trying to get everything fit in to make it happen.
Totally. I'm glad they were able to both make it up. There's just so much going on right now with the farm. We're growing a few new commodities this year: fresh market sweet corn, red bell peppers, banana peppers, and cabbage. So we got quite a few new things to learn just how to integrate in our system, learn the best approach to irrigation. We're doing a few of these commodities in drip this year, which is new for us. We've typically done for irrigation, and just looking how we can reduce our labor costs with irrigation, but also become more efficient as the water situation becomes more and more challenging in California, just looking at ways that we can use less water and be more effective with that. So it's been a good kind of trial and learning season. We're looking to really increase that next season, especially with tomatoes and some of the crops, where we can look at doing kind of permanent beds for 2 to 3 seasons on that and really be able to amortize the cost of drip to do those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think what we're learning through this process is just the concurrent nature of some of these efforts, right? Of drip and reducing water usage and more semi-permanent beds and what that means in terms of reducing tillage. And we're also looking at fertility programs that are focused on soil health and reducing the overall amount of chemicals used on the soil. So all these things are kind of happening at the same time with our crops at scale. And so I think it's going to be, it's a process. It's a multi-year process, but we're putting a lot of the foundational steps in place this year and entering, off-season cover crops into the upcoming off-season.
Yeah, it's definitely been a really, really pivotal year for the farm, building a lot of these different areas. We have our organic fields, the 100 acres that we're growing. This will be our third season of the transition. So next growing season, we'll be able to have our first organically certified produce, which we're super excited about.
Absolutely. Just a few things going on. It's definitely craziness this year with just labor, with water, with all these new crops, with the transition to regenerative agriculture. So I think we're also thinking, how do we balance all of these things and ensure that we have an efficient operation and a streamlined operation given all of the constraints that we're facing. So part of what Tim and I are thinking through is how do we really optimize that over time. Well, guys, we figured, we kind of took a little bit of a vacation to celebrate our mom and spend time with family. And so we're going to re-air an episode this week on the topic of regenerative agriculture with one of the experts in the field. So this is a re-air of one of our most popular episodes with John Kempf, and we get into some awesome discussion here about regenerative agriculture. And I think we don't hold back much here, Tim. And I think it was just so great to hear from John directly about some of the misconceptions, maybe what's snake oil and what's reality when it comes to regenerative agriculture. So I hope if you haven't listened to this episode, please be sure to tune in and hear from John.
Hey, John, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here, Tim and Tyler. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we're really thrilled to talk to you, John, and you obviously have a really successful podcast of your own, so it's always fun to talk to another podcaster. We definitely can understand the heartache and journey that is weekly podcasting. So fun to talk to you, but more importantly, we're excited to talk to you just because of your influence and insight into regenerative agriculture. We talk a lot about it on the podcast. Our farm, Nuss Farms, is actually transitioning to regenerative agriculture, but this word regenerative agriculture, it means a lot to a lot of different people, and I think there's misconceptions. People view it as foolish or naive, and some people think it's going to solve all the world's problems. So we want to kind of have a heart-to-heart with you, John, and talk about what's real, what's here to stay, and really get your experience and expertise in this space. So we're going to just jump in. What do you think is the biggest misconception of regenerative agriculture?
Oh my, I'm not certain I'm the best person to answer that question because I'm so deeply immersed in it. We first started using the phrase regenerative agriculture back in 2011. And so you have to ask the question, where's the biggest misconception? In what space is the biggest misconception? Is it from consumers? Is it from the media? Is it within the farming community? And I think what I can speak to from observation within the farming community is there is the perception that this is another fad that might be here for a few years and then is likely to be transitioned to the sidelines and become a significant minority, like, say, organic certification. And that over time, it's likely that only a minority of farms will be considered to be regenerative farms. I don't expect that to be the case. I expect actually that regenerative agriculture is going to become the mainstream in the next couple of decades, to the point where 80% or more of farms are going to be using regenerative agriculture principles by 2040. And I think there are a number of different driving forces, economics and ecological impact, and a long list of factors that will necessitate that to be true. I believe that for many producers, we'll arrive at a point where that's not particularly an option. It's the way that we'll be required to farm just as a result of market forces, economic forces, and ecological and environmental forces in the farming and agriculture business.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of really good points there. I mean, one thing that I struggle with, and Tyler and I talk a lot about, is just the definition, I guess, lack of definition of regenerative, where the message might be confusing, where people infer different things when you talk about regenerative agriculture. What are your thoughts on how to define it, and does it need to be simplified, or what are your views on how you define that word?
Well, as you indicate, there are lots of people right now who have an opinion and or have an idea of how it should be defined. I'm quite happy to throw my hat in the ring because I think I have a perspective that is perhaps a bit different or not widely considered. And I would propose that regenerative agriculture should be considered to deliver 4 different aspects. One is that we regenerate soil health, whatever that means. That we regenerate plant health and grow crops that are completely resistant to diseases and insects. Third, that we regenerate the overall ecosystem's health and the overall landscape and the ecosystem, larger, greater ecosystem that is surrounding our farms. And fourth, that we regenerate public health. And I think it's particularly that fourth piece that is commonly not addressed or not discussed, but we know that we have a public health epidemic in many Western civilizations and developed countries where our food system, quite simply, our food system is making us sick. We know that we have an epidemic of degenerative diseases, diabetes, stroke, heart disease, cancer, etc. And Agriculture is certainly not the only source of some of the challenges of our food system. We have lots of food processing and things that happen after it leaves the farm gate. But we do also know that we have a lot of toxins that are applied in and on our food supply that are having a significant impact. And I think in order for us to have an honest conversation about regenerating agriculture, we also have to consider human health as one of the final products of our agricultural ecosystems.
Yeah, no, I love how you laid that out, because I think that helps provide guidelines into almost the goalposts, so to speak, of what we're talking about. And the emphasis is regeneration. And I think there is those effects downstream to ultimately public health, which, like you mentioned, is in crisis. I actually recently listened to your interview with Zach Bush talking about the harmful effects that chemical agriculture has had on our food system. And a lot of people can cite different studies, but I think ultimately there has been a dramatic uptick in our health in terms of diseases. So I think that's really critical. Let's talk about one other aspect of this, John. Do you think that regenerative agriculture can solve the global climate challenge?
Let's go straight for the jugular, shall we? Well, oh my, this is such... The sad part of this conversation is that it's become so politicized, and it's a conversation for which certain aspects seem to no longer be open to debate, but I believe they really should be debated, and that we should continue to consider them. So I would propose, on my podcast, I've interviewed Walter Yenny and Jerry Hatfield and various other people who have actually studied the impact of climate or of agriculture on the climate on a global scale, and are much more qualified to speak to this than I am. But what I have learned from people whose opinions I tremendously respect, who I would say have a qualified opinion, and that's a very deliberate phrase, from people who have a qualified opinion, is that agriculture, and in particularly grazing and grassland management, which covers a lot more acres than tilled agriculture, can, when properly managed, do two things. One is it can restore our hydrological cycles. It can restore our rainfall cycles and rain cycles in the what is referred to as the small water cycle, which has a significant effect on cooling local climates. So I'm using local in the context of it can be as little as 5 or 10 mile wide strip, or it can be as much as several 100-mile radius area that can be cooled by changing agriculture in the local landscape. So there are many people who have done this successfully on both smaller and larger scales here in North America and in Australia. So we know absolutely that it is possible to cool landscapes on the local level. Can that also impact the larger macro climate variability that we're observing? Well, certainly the macroclimate is composed of the collective sum of all the local landscape and climates, so to a degree, and it is influenced by all of it. So I do believe that we can have a significant influence, but I think the way that I would describe it in my understanding, it's not that we need to sequester carbon to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. It is that we need to put more carbon into our soil and cycle more carbon through our soil as a means to restore our water systems, as a means to restore our local hydrology. So that is, we still need the same thing, but perhaps for a different reason than the mainstream narrative.
I really like how you laid that out, talking about the micro level and how that corresponds to the macro level. John, what's something that you believe to be true that many of your colleagues in the regenerative space do not?
In regenerative agriculture broadly, there are many people who believe that making cultural management changes and incorporating livestock into the landscape, incorporating cover crops and eliminating tillage and so forth are the pathway to developing regenerative agriculture systems. And I would propose what I believe to be true that is different from many others is that we can tremendously accelerate that system and speed it up by using foliar applications of nutrition and biology to really speed up the conversion process. So there is this idea within regenerative agriculture that it's going to take years to transition and that it will take years before you see economic returns, and that this is really a long-term transition and a long-term switch. Well, that can be the case if we manage it in that way, but the entire premise of our success at AEA has been in facilitating rapid transitions and rapid economic turnaround. So we emphasize and focus on having producers experience economic returns and increase profitability the first year. And to facilitate that, we use foliar applications and sprayed-on applications of biology and nutrition. So we get to the same place, but rather than having a transition take, of course, everything is local context dependent, but let's say a local, one particular farming ecosystem might require 5 to 7 years to transition. I believe it's possible to accomplish the same degree of transition in a year or two by careful management and judicious use of foliar applications of nutrients.
No, I think that's awesome. And we're definitely going to get into that a little bit more when we talk more about advancing eco-ag and your approach. And I think you kind of spoke to it, what makes you a little different. And I think that's important to understand. And, something that we're thinking about on our farm is what does this transition look like and how long does it take? Because you mentioned the cover crops, the integrating livestock, minimizing tillage, right? But are there other ways from a nutrient standpoint, from a biological standpoint that we can be doing to really make this transition happen quicker? Is definitely something that we're interested in selfishly, but I think is a key point that you make with respect to, how people are viewing this. John, what is your opinion of certifications in regenerative ag? I think there's a lot of stuff happening, a lot of noise, and obviously labels, certifications. We can go into a whole rabbit trail about that. But how do you see regenerative agriculture as far as end product really materializing? Do you think it's going to be a certification? Do you think that it's going to be focused on nutrient density, that someone's going to buy or pay a premium for a tomato that has a higher nutrient content than a tomato that's grown conventionally or even organic with less nutrient content? How do you see that whole thing shaping out?
This is a big question. And I'll try to answer as concisely as I can. So in order to answer that question well, we first have to know what our assumptions are. And there are two important foundational assumptions that we may or may not agree on. So one is the expectation that regenerative agriculture will become mainstream and adopted by the majority of growers in the next couple of decades? The answer to that question is going to shape our answer. And then there's a second question, which is, do we believe that consumer demand has ever driven significant change in the food landscape? So I'll share my answers, and I'd love to get your perspective on this as well. So to the first question is do we envision regenerative agriculture only being adopted by 5 or 10% or a minority of farmers in the next couple of decades, or do we perceive it becoming the majority? If it is to become the majority, which is my personal opinion, then that transition may be facilitated, perhaps, by some certifications, but I believe that over time the certifications will become less and less relevant. And an example of this is what is occurring presently with organic certification in certain parts of Europe. And in the Netherlands, for example, and several other countries, I've not been there, I don't know this personally, but from what I have heard speaking with colleagues from there, there is little value in producing organically certified foods in certain parts of Europe, in France, for example, because the mainstream production is so tightly regulated, there is so little pesticide use on some of these crops that there are not significant differences between organic and non-organic production. The differences are so slight that there is almost not enough additional value to be gained in producing organically. So, if it's true that regenerative agriculture becomes the mainstream in 20 years adopted by a majority of farmers, then it is also likely to be true that at that point certification will have significantly less value. Now, on the pathway to getting there, certification may have some value in facilitating that process, or it may not. I think it's debatable. That brings us to our second underlying assumption and question. Has consumer demand, positive consumer demand, ever produced significant change in the agriculture and food supply landscape? And so I used two key phrases there. I used positive consumer demand as compared to negative consumer demand, and significant changes as compared to gradual changes. So if you think about what I mean by positive demand versus negative demand is positive demand or demand for something that doesn't yet widely exist. And organic foods 20 years ago is a good example that there has been a small amount of positive demand that gradually led to the adoption and the production of more and more organic food choices. Whereas negative demand is people who want to avoid something, such as salmonella in greens, for example, where you can have temporary significant negative shocks to the food supply chain where people want to avoid something. So you have avoidance as a negative demand versus desire as a positive demand. And then you also have the scale of change. So you can have gradual change that transitions gradually over time, such as with the adoption of organics, which we have today is still single digits percentages of total U.S. production. And then you have a rapid tsunami of change that occurs very quickly, where a majority of an entire food supply chain changes in a matter of a few years. And an example would be the adoption of genetically modified organisms in corn and soybean production, for example. So the question that I have asked myself is, has there been any example in recent history in the food and agriculture industry where positive consumer demand led to significant change? And I am happy to have someone point out an instance that I am not thinking of. But for myself, I have not been successful in identifying one. There hasn't been any instance that I'm aware of where consumer demand, positive consumer demand, led to large-scale change. So there is this idea within regenerative agriculture that we need to focus on consumer education if we want to change agriculture. My personal opinion is, I disagree. I don't think consumer demand is the pathway to leading to the adoption of regenerative agriculture on a significant scale. And similarly, I have a similar opinion about nutrient density. I'm an advocate, and I say this being an advocate of producing more nutrient-dense foods. I believe that we should produce foods that are so healthy we can have a legitimate conversation about growing food as medicine, and plants that are so healthy that we can eliminate the need for pesticides, which is associated with that. So obviously I'm a big fan, but we have to look at reality and ask the question, how many people really care about consuming nutrient-dense food? And I would argue that it is a fraction of a percent. It's just a fraction of the people who care about organic foods. And if people truly cared about nutrient density, McDonald's would be out of business. And many others like them. I'm using McDonald's as a stand-in for fast food chains, but fast food chains in general would probably be out of business if people truly cared about nutrient density and about consuming a healthy diet. So my perspective is that certifications may be useful, but if our desire is truly to bring about the adoption of regenerative agriculture on scale, that is not likely to occur as a result of consumer demand.
John, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to scaling regenerative agriculture in the next 5 to 10 years, coming from the farm perspective?
The biggest obstacle is negative social pressure and peer pressure. It is fear that we experience as farmers, and I include myself in this. I am a farmer. I grew up on a farm and farmed until just a couple of years ago, and I'm hoping to begin again very soon. And it is a combination of fear, a fear of the unknown, being afraid to try something new, sometimes it's being afraid to acknowledge that perhaps we've used a method of agriculture in the past that is harmful. We are afraid of what people in our family or community or church or the coffee shop are going to say and to think. So it is really that negative social pressure, I think, is one of the biggest obstacles to scaling regenerative ag.
I think you're spot on. I think a lot of it is really simply fear and what your neighbors are going to say. I like how you called that out, and I think that's true. Not to say that there's not a ton of other challenges.
There are other challenges. It is more management intense. It requires paying closer attention. It requires more knowledge. But there is nothing that we need, and I'm using the collective we as a larger agricultural community. We don't need any additional knowledge. We don't need any additional research. Collectively, we already know all the things we need to know to implement regenerative agriculture successfully on scale. We don't need any additional research. We don't need any additional information. We only need to implement what it is that we already know. So within that context, it is only, I think it's fear that keeps us from adopting these different pieces and beginning to experiment with them.
John, thank you so much for that. I think there was, I feel like I need to go back and listen to those responses about 10 times, but that was a ton of value you just shared. And obviously, just from your experience, talking to people and doing this yourself, you've built up that knowledge and expertise. So we want to switch gears here and talk more about you and the businesses that you've built. So maybe provide us just a bit of background and context to who you are, your farm, and what ultimately led you to start advancing eco-ag.
I grew up on a family fruit and vegetable farm in northeast Ohio in the snowbelt south of Lake Erie. And being in the snowbelt, that meant that we had obviously a lot of snow and precipitation during the winter months, but also very humid and hot summers, which is gave us a very disease-prone environment. It's just optimal for propagating powdery mildew and downy mildew and bacterial diseases of all kinds. And we used very intense pesticide applications through the 90s and into the early 2000s. And then we had three consecutive years in 2002, 3, and 4 in which we were not successful in controlling several different bacterial and fungal diseases with fungicide and bactericide applications. And we were using very intense application rates, and it didn't seem to even touch the problem. We ended up having greater than a 70% crop loss 3 years in a row as a result of these disease challenges across the various crops that we were growing on the farm. And at the same time this happened, in 2004, the third year of this 3-year period, we rented a field from a neighboring farm that bordered right up against one of our own fields and planted cantaloupe across the field border at harvest time on the old soil that had a decade of prior intense pesticide applications. 80% of the leaves were infected with powdery mildew, and on the new soil, there was no powdery mildew visible. Not on a single leaf. There was this knife line effect right down through the center of the field, and in fact, there were healthy vines growing right in amongst the unhealthy vines. So I wanted to know, what are the differences between these two plants, and what allows one plant to be susceptible to powdery mildew when the next plant 2 feet away is resistant? And I really set out to study and to try to find the answer to that question. I learned a lot about plant immunity, and I learned that it's possible to grow plants that are completely resistant to all diseases and all insects based on how we manage nutrition. So that after several years of transition on the farm, by 2000, we started managing nutrition differently. By 2006, we were completely pesticide free. And the farm my brothers are running this farm today. They're not organically certified because they are being paid very well for the crops they're producing. There's no economic incentive for them to be organically certified. But they're not using any pesticides of any kind. And that then led to several of my mentors and people that I was working with referring other growers to me to work with. And in 2006, I founded Advancing Eco-Agriculture as a consulting company. Did consulting work for several years based on the premise of managing nutrition to produce disease and insect-resistant crops, and discovered that not only were we achieving disease resistance and insect resistance, but yields were increasing very significantly, usually by 20 to 30% or more, when we started managing nutrition differently. That then led to After several years of running as a consulting company, I became very frustrated with some growers not being able to implement easily because they weren't able to find the types of products that I was recommending, like molybdenum or iodine or selenium supplements or whatever might be the case. And so we switched our business model to become a specialty plant nutrition products company. Started testing products in 2009 and first released them into the marketplace in 2012. So flash forward to today, we work on several thousand farms, mostly here in North America, some international work as well, but mostly here in North America, and minority are organic, majority are not organic, but a desire to transition to using fewer fertilizers and fewer pesticides and producing higher quality crops. So we've gained a reputation for helping producers and growers produce very high quality fruit that stores well, that has really great flavor and aroma, increasing yields, and doing so at lower costs.
John, talk to us about the role that your content plays to complement your business with the blog, the podcast, your book. Maybe talk to us about how you originally started out there and building up a consumer audience.
My personal mission, what I'm really passionate about, is having regenerative agriculture become the mainstream, become the status quo against which everything else is compared. And I see advancing eco-agriculture as one of the engines of change, one of the companies that can produce change in the agricultural landscape simply by being present and doing business in that space. And so our intent as a company at Advancing Eco-Agriculture is not to be all things to all people, but to set such an extremely high standard of excellence, to set such a high bar, that simply by us being present in a local marketplace, in a local region, other companies begin imitating what we do, because we deliver such good information and such great performance and results in the field. So our work revolves not just, transition doesn't happen just in the soil. It happens first between the ears. And so I experienced this personally, and many of the people who are on our team have experienced it. And so our process revolves very much around sharing our information, the things that we have learned freely, the things that we've learned agronomically, how we approach plant nutrition, how we approach producing these high-yielding crops by managing nutrition at specific stages of plant development, the experiences that we have had. So our approach really is that from an agronomic perspective, we have new things that we're learning about all the time that we start using and testing internally within AEA before we begin publicizing them. But we talk about a lot of the things that we have learned in our webinars, in our podcasts, and so forth. And what ultimately happens when you start doing a deep dive into agricultural ecosystems, attempting to understand all the interactions between soil biology and nutrition management, it can appear to be overwhelming. It can appear to be extremely complex. And we can make it sound really complex when we explore all the interactions of all the different facets. So it is our desire to simplify this information and to share it to the degree that people are interested. And I would point out that we should also remember that while we can make it sound really complex in all the interactions, ultimately it is also very simple. And it is simple in the sense that it was designed to work. And what we need to do as farm managers is simply give it the resources that it needs to work effectively as it desires to, and get out of the way. And in some cases, getting out of the way is one of the biggest pieces we need to do.
John, tell us a little bit more about your decision to do a book and your approach, leveraging your podcast interviews, and ultimately what you were thinking about that and how the launch has been.
The book has been very well received. I didn't know exactly what to expect when we published it, but I don't keep close track of the numbers, but we're selling thousands of copies a week, and I'm getting a very favorable response from people who have read it. So how the book came to be, people have been asking me to write a book about our agronomy and our systems approach to how we manage plant nutrition for years. And I sat down to write the outline of a book. And when I was done writing the outline in a bullet point form, it was 40 pages long. And so I realized this was perhaps a much bigger project than I had anticipated. And I was thinking about how to fill in the outline and complete all these various sections with information that I was hoping to share. And then I realized that we have all of this existing content on the podcast and on the webinars that has been recorded, and perhaps we should just try to get that transcribed and then use bits and pieces of that to fill in this larger outline. So we started this process of transcribing and editing the various interviews. And as I was editing these interviews, I have a lot of fun on the podcast because I get to interview all of these amazing people who say some of the most incredible things. And many times after an episode, I will shut down the recording and I'll almost jump up and down and do a fist pump with the great information and knowledge and wisdom that was shared. And so as I started editing the transcriptions, all of a sudden I came to the realization that I would be doing my podcast guests and the readers I would not be doing them a favor by only giving them bits and pieces, that I needed to share the entire context. And so rather than using them to write a book, which is a project that I'm still working on, I decided instead to just release all the transcripts in a series of books. So this was the first volume that was released. I wanted to see how people liked it before I continued doing others. And what I found interesting is that I hosted these interviews. I asked the questions, and I was delighted by the great information that people shared. But a few years go by, and I had forgotten some of the things that people had said, and I found it really valuable to have it written down in a form that I could go back and reference. So that is how the book came to be, and others are in the pipeline to be released as well, and I'm really excited about them. I enjoy reading. I enjoy going back and rereading them again myself.
John, what about the journey throughout this entire process has been most surprising or unexpected for you?
I would say what has been most surprising and most unexpected is the resistance from within the farming community to demonstrated, proven solutions. Many times, growers have told us, if you develop a treatment, a successful treatment for this incurable disease, you will become a multimillionaire. I must have heard that phrase probably a dozen times. If you can develop a treatment for citrus greening, you'll be a millionaire. If you can develop a treatment for Pierce's disease on grapes, if you can develop a treatment for crown gall on walnuts, if you can develop a treatment for bacterial canker on cherries. And we have successfully delivered on each of those diseases that I just mentioned. We have developed demonstrated, proven, successful treatments for, let's say, bacterial canker on cherries as an example. And when I say demonstrated and successful, I'm talking on a scale of multiple blocks, multiple orchards, where we've had field days with hundreds of local farmers coming to look at it. People from the local university have conducted the research. They've observed the fields for a 3-year period. And we have the grower and the local university saying, we used to have severe bacterial canker in these blocks, and now it's completely gone. What has surprised me is the lack of farmer interest and desire in pursuing those treatments, because I don't fully know and understand why this is, but I can only surmise that it is some combination of the fact that it's not a single point and shoot solution. I can't point to one product and say you need to apply product X and you won't have bacterial canker anymore. Instead, what we did, we don't even know exactly what it is that we did. What we did in general is we started managing nutrition differently. In the case of cherries, we started reducing zinc applications and reducing potassium applications, and we increased manganese and we increased copper. And so all of a sudden our nutritional profiles changed. And as the nutrient profiles within the trees changed, and as they were optimized for plant health, we start getting yield increases, we start getting quality increases in terms of firmness and size and sweetness. And all of a sudden, bacterial canker disappears. So I can't point to one thing and say that we put on higher manganese and copper and therefore bacterial canker disappeared. We haven't been able to make that connection. And there may not be a connection to any one nutrient. It's most likely to be a combination. And what has surprised me is that we can have demonstrated success on scale on multiple orchards, and yet the community at large seems to not be interested.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up. I think this has just been so insightful for Tim and I, and we were eating up every word. So hopefully our listeners are experiencing the same. John, this is just, we really appreciate your time. As we finish up and close this episode, how can listeners get in touch and connect with you, your book, and Advancing Eco-Ag?
The best place to connect with the various things that I'm working on is on my personal website, johnkempf.com. And I would invite anyone who is interested in learning and digging a bit more deeply to subscribe to my blog, which goes out between 3 and 5 times per week in the morning. And on that website, we also list the Academy courses and the book and the various companies and enterprises that I'm involved with. Thank you very much for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Hey guys, hope you enjoyed that episode with John Kempf. That was a really, really fun conversation for Ty and I. I wanted to reshare that with all of you that maybe haven't had the chance to listen to it. Some really good thoughts there. And really, as we look ahead for the farm, we're midway through this regenerative journey. And it's always good to go back and look at these kind of episodes and see how far we've come from when we talked to John a year ago and where the farm is right now. So we'll definitely keep you posted as we get farther into the growing season. All the crops are in the ground now, and now we're looking ahead to harvest in the upcoming months.
Thanks so much for listening, guys. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. Have a great week.